'Tis I, your old pal King Chuck, and welcome to another podcast of the Chuck 69 universe. Well, my childhood CBS affiliate, and one of the reasons why I started Chuck 69 in the first place, well, they're in a lot of trouble. Television stations WWTV Channel 9 Cadillac, Traverse City, and WWUP-TV Channel 10 in Sault Ste. Marie are being sued by a former employee who claimed that she was fired for being black. Her on-air name is Sid Simone. Her real name is Sydney McCarty. Sid Simone was the host of the show's mid-morning program called Good Day Northern Michigan several years ago. And according to the lawsuit, she was the show's host, executive producer, and webmaster. Now, according to Sydney, she came to 910 during a very hectic time for the station. What happened was the station was short-staffed, and according to the lawsuit, all hands on deck. So Sydney told the station she was willing to host the nighttime newscasts and do anything that she wanted to do. But instead, the station told her, well, you're going to do the morning show and the morning show only. You're not going to do nights or nothing because, and according to Sydney, they actually told her this, that she was, basically what the station did was compare her to the man who shot up all these dorm rooms at MSU several years ago. He was a black man. And Sydney, they basically said, yeah, you look a lot like him, and people in northern Michigan won't like you for that. So, anyway, Sydney was eventually fired, according to her. According to Sydney, she said that working there, she was basically doing work that was well below her pay grade, and she deserved a lot better. Now here's the story with 9 and 10 right now. Now, 9 and 10, believe it or don't, they actually have a black woman who is who does some anchoring at the station. And her name, by the way, is Gatini Tinsley. And I've seen her work the weekend shift at the station before. So the thing is that, when I hear stories like this, it kind of reminds me of the story of WLBT in Jackson, Mississippi. They were owned by a white supremacist group, the insurance company that bowed to the white supremacy groups in the area, including the KKK. So what happened was, for years, several groups, including the NAACP, United Church of Christ, and even NBC, they were with NBC, they told WLBT-TV that you need to start giving blacks a voice on the station. Now, what happened was every time they would air network programming from NBC, if there was a black person being interviewed, or if they did a news story about race relations in America on the Huntley-Brinkley report, they cut to black and say, whoops, cable trouble. And the real truth was, Lamar Life Insurance, the owners, they basically said, we don't want them colored folks in our station. So over the years, WLBT decided that to get, the story was the FCC was starting to give them like notice of apparent violations and threats of license revocation, stuff like that. So this is what they did. They actually put Medgar Evers, who himself was a civil rights activist. They had him they allowed him to provide a speech on TV one evening. And the speech was like 25 minutes long or whatever. And what had happened was the station was pounded with multiple complaints from white people who were saying, yeah, we're going to come to the station and kick his ass. We don't want them in N-words in our neighborhood. So, anyway, and not only that, they actually hired a black man to anchor a newscast back in the late 60s. But it was not enough to make the FCC happy. So they took the license away. They took WLBT's license away and gave it to a nonprofit who worked on rebuilding race relations for everybody in Jackson, Mississippi. So anyway, the rest of the story was that I think that's what 910 is doing. They are just doing this to tell everyone we're not a racist company. We're not pulling, we're not like Sinclair. They even ran promos that said, better begins with us. And it shows clips of white supremacy shit and, racism. And basically they're trying to tell everyone we're not Sinclair. But the sad truth is 9 and 10 is what I like to call Sinclair Jr. at times. One of the reasons why I started Chuck69.com, which was originally called Bring Howard Stern to Northern Michigan Radio and TV, was because 9 and 10 once aired Howard Stern's nighttime, Saturday night show. And they canceled it and replaced it with Charlton Heston's NRA infomercials. And Charlton Heston was out there telling everyone that because of Columbine, them liberals were going to take away our guns. Well, guess what happened? Charlton Heston was a total asshole. I mean, watch Playing for Columbine and you'll understand that Heston was an asshole. He walked away from Michael Moore after Moore gave him a picture of a little girl who was murdered by one of her classmates in Flint, Michigan, because that classmate had a gun. And, and what's even more damning was that they named a charter school in St. Helen near Roscommon after Charlton Heston because he grew up there. It's like, I don't give a fuck. Yeah, let's name a synagogue after Hitler. Let's name a elementary school after Ted Nugent, even though the guy was a fucking pedophile. Let's do all that. But that's the way of the world, folks. That is, unfortunately, the way of the world. Is that 9 and 10 bowed to Charlton Heston and the NRA because, they had money. And the Stern Show was being attacked by these religious nuts who wanted to take money away from Howard Stern and his syndicators, and that's what it boiled down to. Howard was the bad guy because, he had naked girls on his show. He made penis jokes and poop jokes. And no. And yet here's Rush Limbaugh telling everyone that that cigarettes don't cause lung cancer. And guess what he died from? You guessed it, lung cancer. And, that's the problem with Northern Michigan. It's very... you have to remember that Northern Michigan isn't, very, very white. The lawsuit, of course, stated that Cadillac, Michigan, where the station was at the time, was 98% white. And the town was basically all white folk plus Sydney. And of course, over the years, 9 and 10 has, taken shows off the air because of content concerns. Another show was a 9/11 documentary because of, they claimed that the show was going to cost them FCC fines left and right. And I think the real truth was there were no commercials. CBS did not provide affiliates with commercial breaks. And it was election season, so 9 and 10 used that excuse because, it was just after the Janet Jackson nip slip. And, and guess who had a lot of money for commercials? You guessed it. It was Dick DeVos. He was running for governor at the time. Of course, he was going around playing with daddy's money. And thankfully, he lost the election because he was George W. Bush Jr. And let's not forget that the DeVos family is the reason why if you're a lonely guy in Grand Rapids, you don't have a strip club to go to anymore unless you want to drive all the way to Muskegon. And I'm a very lonely guy, I'm sorry. It breaks my heart that, I'm 44 years old and, I'm on all these dating sites all the time, and the only people who swipe right on me aren't the type of people I want to date. They're people who live too far away, or they already have kids, or, have a few extra chins. I don't want that. And there's even a few who aren't really women, if you know what I mean. So the rest of the story was, and not only that, 9 and 10, a few years ago, kicked themselves really hard in the ass when they hired a woman named Christina Ahio to anchor their 6 and 11 newscasts. And, Christina got herself into a heap of trouble when she worked in Texas because she did this goody two-shoes interview with Ken Paxton that was very one-sided, and basically it was she basically made a propaganda piece that told everyone that Joe Biden was evil and that Ken was a good family man, even though he cheated on his wife, and, Ken was on a mission to stop pornography in Texas, and, of course, the Supreme Court sided with him, tragically. The only good thing I can say about Christina is that she no longer works at 9 and 10. She left to go back down to Texas. She now works for, not Sinclair, but another bad media company, Salem. And Salem, of course, is the company that Charlie Kirk worked for. Charlie Kirk, of course, he was assassinated, and Dennis Prager. And I'm happy to say that Dennis is not doing very well because he had a fall in his home, and I see that he's hooked up to a oxygen tank. So Prager was the guy behind PragerU, which is, this nonprofit that's telling kids and families that stuff like slavery was a good thing and Christopher Columbus was a good guy, and, basically it's right-wing indoctrination that's a whole bunch of wrong and a half. So anyway, the rest of the story is that, 9 and 10 is not on the right side of history. Plus, like Sinclair, they use a shell company to buy another TV station. They own Fox 32. It used to be Fox 32, now it's Local 32. They don't use Fox anymore, even though they're still a Fox affiliate. And they have a friend in Texas. The family that owns 9 and 10, they have a friend in Arizona, excuse me. And he owns, so they're paying him to buy 32, even though, legally, you can only own one TV station in northern Michigan. And 9 and 10, unfortunately, it's like there's a lot of shady shit with the Iacobelli family that who own 9 and 10. So there you go. And of course now they've moved into this brand new studio, and the studio is about the size of a little closet. I've seen this studio. It's like, what the hell? It's like it's a really tiny studio, and its only good feature is that, well, it has this 10-foot monitor and a little monitor to the side. So I don't know. By the way, I have my executive producer with me. She's barking at people. So the reality, folks, is 910 is not, they're like Sinclair. They are Sinclair Jr. And I know a lot of people in northern Michigan are fed up with this bullshit of just two companies telling you the news in northern Michigan. Not only that, speaking of Sinclair, I see that Maya Engel, who was the former nighttime news anchor at 7 and 4, she finally made a message online about her recent dismissal from the station. And she gave out like this cryptic message on Facebook. Let me try to bring it up here. And but basically there was rumors that there we go. So it says here, officially an end of an era. When I took this picture on my first day Up North Live, that's the name they give 7 and 4 and ABC 29 and 8, nearly 5 years ago, I was fresh off college and had no idea how this job would shape me into the woman I am today, blah, 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 blah. And it says here, as I grow in my career, I realize that when your values and your work are aligned, you're able to show up better and do your best, most authentic work. Towards the end of my time at the station, this is something I really struggled with, and I wasn't able to show up the way my team need me to do. Now, there was a rumor that the reason why she was let go from Up North Live 7 and 4 was because she trashed Sinclair for how they treated Jimmy Kimmel. So I'm like, she basically bit the hand that fed her. And my take is, the sad truth is, for 10 and a half years, I worked for an asshole who didn't want to give us raises and didn't care for us. And what happened was he ended up, I've seen people getting fired for finally speaking the truth to him. He was like Donald Trump. You tell Donald Trump the truth and you get fired. I mean, that's why we don't get reports on our economy anymore. It was because the last woman, the woman that gave Trump these reports, she was fired for telling the truth. And the truth was Trump's policies are destroying America. And that Trump is lying to us and telling us that tariffs are a wonderful thing. And it's history repeating, folks. Tariffs are why we had the Great Depression in the first place. Now we got people lining up at soup kitchens because of his policies. It's like, what the fuck, dude? And what's even worse is, like I said, Sinclair is a right-wing company. And my boss was a right-wing asshole. My former boss didn't give me a raise for years. Didn't allow me to grow as a person and a human being. I had people calling me a $8 an hour loser and calling me a loser because I lived in the so-called Kentwood ghetto. I wasn't people were not allowing me to grow as a person. And the reason why was because we had a really bad president in the White House who was more about war and making Iraqi people happy. And I'm like, okay, Trump is just like George W. Bush. And, he's given $40 billion to Argentina, and we're, of course, we got this giant new monstrosity of a ballroom that's being built that's replacing the entire east wing of the White House. It's like, this is not leadership. I miss Joe Biden by a million miles. He was such a better president, and if he was still president, this country would have been much better off now. But it ain't happening because of all the tariffs that Trump is putting everywhere, including Canada. And guess where, I work, folks? I work in a book bindery. I work in a book bindery, book publishing company. And guess where all of our paper comes from? It comes from, you guessed it, Canada. I don't know, folks. I don't know where to begin with this asshole. But anyway. So, I know that there's that small part of me that says, at least, some of you might be thinking, who have watched Northern Michigan TV from way back in the day, 29 and 8 was a really shitty station, and so was Fox. Back then it was Fox 33. With the digital switchover, went to Channel 32. And so that's what happened. And it had all the 4 stations had different owners, and then, and of course the owners of 7 and 4 created a shell company to take over 29 and 8, and did it with 9 and 10, and and basically it's to take competition away, and it's depressing. And so anyway, I don't blame Sid Simone for suing 9 and 10, because, and not only that, Northern Michigan is very racist. True story. One of the saddest stories about Northern Michigan came from Michael Moore. Michael had a meeting with James Earl Jones a number of years ago, and he recalled the story about why he has a bit of a grudge against Traverse City. It was because he went to school in Brethren, which is this small town near Manistee, and he was a mute child. He had a stutter, and he read a poem in class, and the teacher loved him. He did it beautifully. So he was put onto the debate team, and he was helping to win championship after championship. And then suddenly he went to he and his fellow students went to a restaurant in Traverse City, and as everybody was being seated, a staffer from the restaurant came to him and said, "We do not serve colored people here." And this is Traverse City, Michigan. It's not Birmingham, Alabama, or Jackson, Mississippi. This is Northern Michigan. And it's like, and it's true. Northern Michigan. So yeah, he began this grudge against Traverse City because of this. So what happened was, all the years I've lived in Northern Michigan, I saw racism everywhere. I knew a lot of kids who used the N-word. I saw, hell, I even was profiled myself because of my autism. And I had people call me names like faggot and retard, and it hurt me. And I didn't have many friends growing up, even though my father, who got me into living in Northern Michigan in the first place and hating every moment of it, almost. He tried to push me into making friends, and it was like, dude, you're from Detroit, and there's nothing to do in Northern Michigan. It's like you have to be 21 to do anything because it's all drunks up here, too. And I want to tell you a sad story about my parents. Well, better yet, I want to tell you this story first. I told you this story before, but I'll tell it to you again. I once worked at a popular restaurant in northern Michigan, and the woman who owned this restaurant, my boss, kept a photo album of her family's old restaurant. You know, she had the family owned another restaurant in town, and in it were all these old photos of all these minstrel shows that the restaurant used to have. And these were not photos taken in the 1930s. This was the 1960s. And in her words, she was like, yeah, the NAACP told us to stop doing it. And not only that, a lot of times they would have karaoke at the restaurant, and I was not allowed to go up there because after my shift ended, it was 21 and over, and I was a teen at the time. It was like I was voiceless. It was like I was left out all the time, and I had no circle. This is why I started, part of the reason why I started Chuck 69. It was because I wanted to tell the media up north, start thinking about us. And they've done some good work, you know. Of course, now there's a hard rock station in Traverse City, Rock 105 and 95.5. But guess what? It's too little too late, because now there's Sirius, Octane. Octane is way better than Rock 105 and 95.5. I mean, all their DJs have a good, positive attitude. Rock 105 and 95.5, it's a bunch of old people from Riff and the Riff in Detroit, and and not only that, they don't do a good job of adding new music. And there's a lot of bands they don't even play on there, which is stupid. Yeah, Cartman is not a good programming director at all. And he's just beyond obnoxious. Yeah, I can go on and on, but the sad truth of the matter is that, it's not just my old hometown that had these minstrel shows. I saw an old newspaper that had an advertisement for a minstrel show in another town. And it was all over northern Michigan. They did this because it was all white people. And it's true. A lot of people who live in northern Michigan moved up there to get away from the black folks. So, but I want to tell you another story. You see, the reason why I lived in northern Michigan as opposed to Detroit. So, I was so depressed growing up because there wasn't much to do where I was 10 miles from anything. And even the closest town 10 miles from us was a small town that didn't have a whole lot anyway. And I wished I could have lived closer to Traverse City so I can go to the mall, go to a movie, instead of just sitting around all weekend, just bored to tears. Sorry, my dog, there's a guy bringing a bunch of ducks. My dog's barking at them. So anyway, okay, so I want to tell you a sad story about my upbringing. So what happened was, kids, we had some kids who rode my school bus who used to bring up tapes of 96.3 in Detroit, and they had these mixed shows, and they were way, Northern Michigan radio was far more vanilla than the stations downstate were. As a matter of fact, I even remembered in the early 90s, 106.7, The Peak, our little top 40 station in Traverse City, they developed a new slogan: the hottest hits without the hard rock and rap. And what was funny was they were still playing bands like Van Halen and Guns N' Roses. So basically, rap was bad. And I think a lot of it was because of the outcry about Ice-T and Cop Killer and all the gangster rap that was out there. And even worse, 106.7 started playing more country music, which I hate country with a passion. I've always hated most forms of country music. Older country music I'm okay with. So what happened was, the story was, when I was a young kid growing up, I used to think to myself, 96.3 was such a cool station. Why did we get stuck with this shitty radio up north? So what happened was, one day at the dinner table, I told my parents, I wish I lived in Detroit. And my parents were telling me straight up that, oh, this is what they do in Detroit. Black people go into people's houses and they rob and they steal and they shoot. Do you want that up here, Charlie? And of course, Halloween is this week. And it used to be, I don't know if it's still a tradition or not in Detroit, the Devil's Night. And houses were being burnt down. And my parents were like, yeah, this is what they do in Detroit, Charlie. Do you want your house to be burnt down? Well, meanwhile, of course, there was this came around the same time as of course, we all remember the situation in Los Angeles where there was a black man who was Rodney King, who was beaten up by a group of police officers. And when the cops were acquitted, black people just went ahead and burnt down Los Angeles. And my parents were trying to get it into my head that black people were bad people. But then what happened was, there was so the story was, I went to a mostly white school. There were a couple of Hispanics and a couple of Native Americans, because, Northern Michigan has a lot of tribal land and stuff like that. But anyway, there was a black kid that came into our bus, and I wouldn't allow him to sit with me. And word got to my dad, he was my bus driver, that I was being a racist, and and my dad the next day told me, you better allow him to sit with you. And my dad and I had a conversation when we got home, and it was like in a snap of the fingers, it was the whole dialogue of African Americans changed. That not all black people are evil and violent and they're not going to kill you, blah, 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 blah. And I think it's because, this is why they moved up here. It was to get away from black people. My mom and dad lived in an apartment complex, a little duplex in Detroit, where the other family, they were black people. And what's sad is this is the life they introduced me to. And it's like, even today up in Northern Michigan, there's people who look at other black folks and they're like, and they will, deep down inside, they call them the N-word, and they're stupid, and I'm like, I agree with Dr. King. You judge a person not by the skin color, but by their character. If they're nice to you, be nice to them back. Treat people the way you want to be treated. And for 9 and 10, which is a white-owned station, by the way, it's sad that they fired this woman who was the only black employee at the station at the time. And I know the station has had done a better job of hiring, being more inclusive. I mean, they are more inclusive than 7 and 4. By the way, I noticed that 7 and 4's nighttime anchor, along with Mark Shillette, is another white dude. Whoop-de-doo. And some people are now calling 7 and 4 a meat market. The point is, folks, is this is Northern Michigan, and I know that the problem is that professionalism in Northern Michigan is not professionalism at all. I mean, I'll tell you what happened to me earlier this year. I went to Fantasies in the afternoon, on a Saturday afternoon. I was really hoping the place would have a lot of beautiful girls and I can get good lap dances and stuff. And unfortunately, I had to leave because my mom told me, you know, I was with my mom at the time. She was with her friend, and she told me to come home. And of course, I didn't want to tell my mom, yeah, I'm at the strip club. Well, unfortunately, I ended up having to get a lap dance from one of the managers, and it was not one of the best lap dances I ever got. And it was $50. So will I go back to Fantasies anytime soon? Probably not. And then I had to go get dinner. So I went to Culver's, and what happened was when they handed me my drinks, they didn't put it in a coaster like the Culver's down here does. And I had to find places for all my drinks, and by the time I got back to my mom's friend's house, one of the drinks spilled over one of my seats. It's like, okay, you know, that's the problem with Northern Michigan. Professionalism doesn't really count up there because it's, you know, it's it's amateur hour up there. Not only that, you know, I went to a restaurant up in Elk Rapids called The Foundry about a year ago too, and the burger they gave me was still pink in the middle. And of course, the place has since closed down, and their excuse was that, well, overhead was high. So, anyway, so the long story short is this, you know, sometimes I just feel bad living up north. And I had to, you know, and here in Grand Rapids, yes, I've had my fair share of troubles too, but Northern Michigan can do better than this. And I hope that 9 and 10 can realize that what they did was wrong, and that maybe they should give out their side of the story, which they haven't, and people will, and, you know, at the end of the day, they'll learn their lesson. All right, folks, I gotta get going. Have a good week, and I'll talk to you later. Good day and good luck.